The chandeliers of Hartsworth House blazed with 1,000 candles on that fateful evening in April of 1847. Their crystalline flames reflected endlessly in gilded mirrors, until the ballroom seemed to contain within it all the stars that London's coal-smoke skies had stolen from the heavens. The air hung thick with the perfume of hothouse roses' blooms, forced into unseasonable splendor by the wealth of their hosts, and beneath that sweetness lurked the sharper notes of French cologne, champagne, and the particular electricity that only a masquerade could conjure. For on this night, the rules that governed society had been temporarily suspended, tucked away behind feathered masks and silk dominoes, and the assembled aristocracy moved through the candlelight like beautiful ghosts, freed from the burden of their own names. Lady Rosalind Ashworth stood at the edge of this glittering chaos, her fingers pressed against the cool marble of a pillar, as if it alone could anchor her to the earth. Her mask was a delicate creation of peacock feathers and seed pearls, chosen by her mother to complement the sapphire engagement ring that weighed upon her hand like a shackle, forged from promises she had never been permitted to refuse. In 3 weeks, she would become Viscountess Thornbury, wife to a man whose smile never reached his eyes, and whose grip on her arm during their public appearances left bruises she had learned to hide beneath carefully chosen sleeves. Asterisk, 3 weeks asterisk, she thought, and the words tasted of ashes and resignation. Asterisk, 3 weeks until I disappear entirely into a life I did not choose. Asterisk, but tonight she had slipped away from her mother's watchful gaze, had woven through the masked crowds until she found this small sanctuary near the towering windows that overlooked the gardens, and for these few stolen hours she would permit herself to breathe. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, and Rosalind watched the dancers spin past in their elaborate disguises, wondering if any of them felt as trapped within their finery as she did within hers. It was then that she heard the voice, a low, resonant murmur that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and settle somewhere deeper, somewhere she had long since learned to ignore. "You look as though you're attending a funeral rather than a ball." She turned, and the air between them seemed to thicken with something she could not name. He was tall, this stranger, broad of shoulder beneath an impeccably tailored black coat, his face obscured by a mask of raven's feathers that cast shifting shadows across features she could only partially discern. Dark hair, darker eyes that caught the candlelight and held it prisoner, and a mouth that curved with the particular amusement of someone who had learned long ago that the world would judge him regardless of his expression. "Perhaps I am," Rosalind replied, surprising herself with her own boldness. "There are many kinds of death, sir, and not all of them require a coffin." Something flickered behind his mask recognition, perhaps not of her face but of her sentiment, and when he extended his gloved hand toward her, she understood that she stood at the threshold of either salvation or ruin. She did not yet know that the stranger before her was Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenscar, whose very name had been spoken as a curse within the walls of her father's house for 3 generations. She knew only that his voice made her feel, for the first time in months, that she was something more than a transaction in silk and diamonds. And so, God help her. She took his hand. His hand was warm even through the barrier of their gloves, and when he drew her into the waltz, Rosalind felt as though she had stepped outside the boundaries of her own carefully circumscribed existence, and into a story that belonged to someone braver, someone who had never learned to fold herself into the small spaces that society demanded of Earl's daughters. They moved together with an ease that startled her, his lead confident but not commanding, guiding her through the turns as though they had danced 1,000 times before in some life she could not quite remember. "You speak of death with remarkable composure for a woman so young," he observed, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice rather than the practiced flattery she had learned to expect from gentlemen of the ton. "I have been prepared for a kind of death since I was 17, she replied, emboldened by the anonymity of her mask and the champagne warmth that had loosened her carefully guarded tongue. "The death of possibility, of choice, of the woman I might have become had I been born to different circumstances." The stranger, for she must think of him as a stranger, must not allow herself to wonder about the man behind the raven. Feathers was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its sardonic edge. "And yet, you came tonight, despite this impending doom of yours." "Perhaps because of it," she confessed. "In 3 weeks, I will belong to a man who sees me as an acquisition, a means of improving his bloodline, and managing his household. Tonight is the last night I shall ever belong to myself. She felt his hand tighten almost imperceptibly at her waist, a reaction so subtle she might have imagined it. "I understand more than you know," he said quietly. "There is a particular loneliness in being seen only as what others have decided you must be: a title, a reputation, a convenient villain in someone else's narrative. I have walked into ballrooms and watched faces close like doors, watched whispers follow me like a funeral procession, and I have long since ceased to wonder if they might see anything beyond the name I inherited." Rosalind looked up into those dark eyes, searching for the mockery she expected, but finding instead a weariness that echoed something deep within her own chest. "What did you inherit?" she asked softly. "A legacy of broken things," he replied, "and the universal expectation that I shall break everything I touch." The music swelled around them, and for a suspended moment, neither spoke. Two masked strangers circling each other in a sea of candles and secrets, each recognizing in the other a kindred isolation. When the clock in the corner began its slow procession toward midnight, chiming 11 times through the perfumed air, he leaned close enough that his breath stirred the feathers of her mask. "The gardens," he murmured, "are quite beautiful in the moonlight, and considerably less crowded than this fishbowl of judgment. Would you permit me to show you?" Every lesson in propriety, every warning her mother had ever issued, screamed at her to refuse. But Rosalind looked into the eyes of this stranger who spoke of loneliness as she felt it, who seemed to see past her sapphire shackles to the woman suffocating beneath, and she made the choice that would alter the course of her entire existence. She took his arm, and together they slipped through the glass doors into the silver-drenched darkness beyond, leaving the safety of the ballroom behind them, like travelers abandoning the shore for uncertain seas. The garden lay before them like a secret kept too long, its hedgerows silver-touched by moonlight, its gravel paths winding between rose bushes that had surrendered their petals to the advancing night and stood now as skeletal sentinels to whatever might unfold in the shadows they created. Rosalind felt the cool air brush against her heated skin like a whispered warning, but she did not heed it, could not heed it, for the stranger's hand remained warm upon her arm, and the distance between propriety and disaster had never seemed so small or so insignificant. They walked in silence past the marble fountain, where a stone Aphrodite wept endless tears into her basin, past the arbor heavy with climbing jasmine, whose sweetness seemed to drug the very air, until they reached a small alcove, where the hedges rose high enough to shield them from the glittering windows of the ballroom and the hundreds of eyes that moved behind them. "I should not have come here with you," Rosalind breathed, though she made no move to leave, and when he turned to face her, the moonlight caught the sharp planes of his jaw beneath the raven mask, and rendered him something not quite human, a figure from myth, perhaps, or from the kind of dreams that left one aching upon waking. "No," he agreed, his voice roughened by something she recognized because she felt it burning in her own chest. "You should not have, and I should not have asked. And yet here we stand. Two people who have spent their lives doing what they should, until the weight of it threatens to crush them entirely." She did not know who moved first. Perhaps they moved together, drawn by the same inexorable gravity that pulls the tide toward the shore. But suddenly the distance between them had vanished, and his hands were cupping her face with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. And then his lips met hers, and the world as she had known it simply ceased to exist. The kiss began as something gentle, questioning, a conversation conducted in the language of breath and trembling contact, but it deepened with a swiftness that left her dizzy, her fingers clutching the lapels of his coat as though he alone could prevent her from drowning in the flood of sensation that threatened to sweep away everything she had been taught to value. His mouth tasted of champagne and something darker, something that spoke of hunger long denied, and when she parted her lips beneath his, the sound he made, low and desperate and wholly undone, ignited something within her that she had never known existed. I need to see you," she gasped against his lips. "I need to know." And her trembling fingers found the ties of her own mask before she could think better of it, pulling it away to reveal her flushed face to the moonlight, and to him. He went still, and then his hands rose to his own mask with the deliberate motion of a man approaching the gallows, and as the raven feathers fell away, Rosalind felt her heart stutter and stop in her chest. She knew that face, had seen it rendered in the portrait that hung in her father's study, slashed through with red paint by some ancestor who could not bear to look upon Blackwood features even in oils. The Duke of Ravenscar stared back at her with eyes that held the same dawning horror she felt clawing up her own throat, and in the terrible silence that stretched between them, the sound of approaching voices and the bobbing lights of carried lanterns broke through the hedgerows like an invading army. "Lady Rosalind," a woman's voice shrieked with scandalized delight. "And is that good God?" "It is the Duke of Ravenscar." They stood frozen in the lamplight's accusation, her lips still swollen from his kisses, his hands still cradling empty air where her face had been, and Rosalind understood with crystalline clarity that the life she had known had ended the moment she removed her mask, that she had not escaped one cage but merely stumbled, blind and willing, into another, far more terrible, and she had brought her family's greatest enemy with her into the fall. The scandal moved through London with the swiftness and devastation of a plague, carried on the breath of every gossip and whispered across every breakfast table before the Morning Post had even arrived, so that by the time Rosalind descended the stairs of Pemberton House, with the pale light of dawn turning her sleepless face to marble, she found her father already pacing the morning room like a caged beast, his fury so palpable that the very air seemed to tremble with it. "You have destroyed us," the Earl of Pemberton pronounced, and his voice held none of the thunderous rage she had expected, but rather something far worse, a cold, measured devastation that stripped each word to its sharpest edge. 3 generations of honor, of careful alliances, of standing in society, and you have torn it all to ribbons for what? A kiss in a garden with the one man in all of England whose touch could poison this family beyond redemption. Her mother sat weeping in the corner, her handkerchief already soaked through, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief, from the place where dreams of grandchildren and society weddings and the continuation of everything she had built her life around now lay in smoking ruins. The Morning Post had brought a letter from Viscount Hartley, Rosalind's erstwhile betrothed, written in language so cutting that her father had burned it immediately after reading, though not before the words "soiled goods" and "Blackwood's whore" had seared themselves into Rosalind's consciousness like brands upon flesh. The engagement was publicly dissolved, announced not with the quiet dignity of mutual agreement but with the vindictive flourish of a man scorned, and by noon the calling cards had stopped arriving, and the invitations for the season had begun to be quietly rescinded, one by one, like candles being extinguished throughout a great house until only darkness remained. "The Blackwood curse," her father spat, and in his eyes Rosalind saw not just anger but genuine fear, the kind that had been bred into him from childhood, passed down through generations like a hereditary disease. "Your grandfather warned me, warned us all, that they would find a way to destroy what they could not possess, and now his youngest son's whelp has accomplished what duels and lawsuits could not. He has taken my daughter and made her unmarriageable, untouchable, a pariah in the only world that matters." Rosalind wanted to protest, wanted to explain that Alexander had not taken anything she had not freely offered, that for one brief and shining moment in that moonlit garden, she had felt more alive than in all her 22 years of careful compliance. But the words died in her throat because she understood with terrible clarity that the truth would only make things worse. She had wanted him, had chosen him, and that wanting, that choosing, was the unforgivable sin. Not the kiss itself, not even the discovery, but the fact that some treacherous part of her heart, even now, even standing in the wreckage of everything she had known, could not bring itself to regret the taste of him, the feel of his hands upon her face, the desperate sound he had made when their lips met, and it was this shameful, persistent warmth beneath the ashes of her reputation that frightened her most of all. The Duke of Ravenscar arrived at Pemberton House on the 3rd day, after the scandal broke, his carriage black as a hearse, and bearing the crest that had made Ashworth blood boil for 3 generations, and Rosalind watched from the shadowed landing of the staircase as her father's butler, pale-faced and trembling, announced the visitor, whose very name seemed to poison the air of their receiving room. Alexander stood in the doorway like a man facing execution, his dark hair swept back severely from a face that showed the same sleepless hollows that Rosalind had seen in her own mirror that morning. And when her father rose from his chair with murder written plainly in every rigid line of his body, the Duke did not flinch but merely inclined his head with a dignity that seemed almost cruel in its composure. "You dare," the Earl breathed, and his hand moved instinctively toward the bell pull, as though he might summon footmen to physically remove this intruder, this destroyer, this walking embodiment of everything the Ashworth family had learned to hate. "You dare to enter my home after what you have done to my daughter, to my name, to everything I have spent my life protecting." But Alexander's voice, when he spoke, held none of the arrogance Rosalind had been taught to expect from Blackwood. Men held instead a weight of resignation that stopped her father's hand mid-reach and drew her own body forward against the banister, straining to hear words she somehow knew would change the course of her ruined life. "I have come to offer the only reparation society will accept," Alexander said, and his eyes lifted briefly to the staircase where Rosalind stood half hidden in shadow, and in that momentary glance she saw something that made her breath catch, not triumph, not calculation, but a shame so profound it seemed to age him years in seconds. "I am here to propose marriage to Lady Rosalind, to give her my name and my protection, to restore what honor can be restored through the only means available to us both." The Earl's laugh was terrible, a sound scraped raw from somewhere between fury and disbelief, and he advanced on Alexander with fists clenched at his sides, as though he might strike a duke in his own receiving room and damn the consequences. "I would see her in a convent," he snarled. "I would see her dead and buried in hallowed ground before I would see her wear your cursed name, before I would give you the satisfaction of completing what your family has sought for decades, the utter destruction of mine." Rosalind's mother sobbed quietly in the corner, but Rosalind herself felt something strange crystallizing in her chest as she watched Alexander absorb this rejection without argument, without defense, his shoulders bearing the weight of hatred he had inherited rather than earned. And when his eyes found hers again through the dim light of the stairwell, she saw in them not the villain of her childhood stories, but simply a man isolated, resigned, offering what little he could to repair damage they had both created, and before she could think, before reason could intervene, she was descending the stairs with her hand outstretched, and her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs, saying words that would sever her from everything she had known. "I accept." The church stood small and unremarkable on the outskirts of London, a place where neither Ashworth nor Blackwood name had ever echoed, where the ancient stones held no memory of the hatred that had brought these two families to this cold and cheerless union, and Rosalind stood in the vestibule wearing dove-grey silk, the colour of mourning, of compromise, of something that was neither innocent nor wholly condemned, while a hired woman she had never met adjusted the modest veil that would do nothing to hide the absence of joy on her face. There were no guests in the pews, no flowers adorning the altar, no music to herald her walk down the aisle, only the vicar, uncomfortable and eager to have this irregular business concluded, and Alexander waiting at the front with his jaw set so tightly she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, his eyes fixed on some point above her head as though he could not bear to witness what they were about to do. The vows emerged from her throat as hollow sounds, words she had dreamed of speaking someday, with trembling hope, now delivered with the flat precision of a woman signing away the last vestiges of the life she had known, and when Alexander slid the ring onto her finger, a Blackwood heirloom, she realized with a start, heavy gold set, with a ruby dark as old blood, his hands were as cold as her own. He did not kiss her when the vicar pronounced them wed, he merely offered his arm with formal courtesy, and they walked together back down the empty aisle, while their footsteps echoed like accusations in the silence. And Rosalind thought that this must be what it felt like to attend one's own funeral, this strange suspension between what had been and what would never be again. The carriage that waited outside bore the Ravenscar crest upon its door, and as Alexander handed her inside with impeccable, distant politeness, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the polished black lacquer, a ghost in grey, a woman without a family, a duchess without a wedding feast or well-wishes, or even the memory of her mother's embrace to carry with her into this new and terrifying chapter. They did not speak as London fell away behind them, as the cobblestones gave way to country roads and the buildings thinned and eventually disappeared, replaced by rolling hills that grew progressively wilder, more windswept, more desolate with each passing mile. Rosalind watched Alexander's profile against the carriage window, studied the hard line of his mouth and the shadows beneath his eyes, and wondered what thoughts moved behind that impenetrable facade, whether he regretted his offer, whether he blamed her for accepting, whether he felt anything at all beyond the grim satisfaction of duty discharged. The countryside transformed as they travelled north, the gentle green of the home counties giving way to moorland that stretched dark and endless under a sky that seemed to press lower with each passing hour, heavy with clouds that threatened storms they might not outrun. She pulled her travelling cloak tighter against a chill that seemed to emanate not from the weather, but from the vast and uncharted silence between them. Two strangers bound now by law and scandal, journeying toward a castle she had heard described only in terms of foreboding, toward a future she could not imagine and had not chosen, yet somehow had accepted. And as the first drops of rain began to strike the carriage windows like tears, the sky was weeping on her behalf. Rosalind closed her eyes and tried not to think about the warmth of his kiss in the moonlit garden, tried not to remember how different his touch had felt when neither of them knew the weight of the names they carried, because that memory, that treacherous sweetness, was the cruelest thing of all. Ravenscar Castle rose from the moorland like a creature born of the very stone and storm that surrounded it, its towers black against a sky that seemed perpetually threatening, its windows reflecting nothing but the grey emptiness of the landscape that stretched in every direction without mercy or softness, and Rosalind felt her heart contract as the carriage passed through gates topped with iron ravens, whose wings seemed poised for flight that would never come. Alexander handed her down with the same formal courtesy he had maintained throughout their journey, his gloved fingers releasing hers the moment propriety allowed, and she followed him up the worn stone steps, while servants lined the entrance hall with faces carefully blank. Though she caught the quick, nervous glances they exchanged, the way they seemed to shrink slightly as their master passed, and she wondered what manner of man she had married, what cruelties might lurk behind the composed facade he presented to the world. "Mrs. Blackwood will show you to your chambers," he said, and his voice echoed in the cavernous hall with its vaulted ceiling and ancient tapestries depicting hunts and battles long forgotten. "You will find them adequate, I trust, and anything you require you need only ask." And then he was gone, disappearing through a doorway without looking back, leaving her alone with a housekeeper whose keys jangled like chains as she led Rosalind up a staircase that wound through the heart of the castle like a spine of cold grey stone. Her chambers were indeed adequate, more than adequate, she admitted reluctantly, taking in the heavy velvet drapes in deep burgundy, the fire already blazing in a hearth large enough to stand in, the bed hung with embroidered curtains that must have taken some long-dead seamstress years to complete. Yet the rooms felt as isolated as a tower prison, separated from the master's quarters by a corridor that stretched dark and unwelcoming, a physical manifestation of the distance Alexander clearly intended to maintain. In those first days, Rosalind wandered the castle like a ghost haunting halls she had no right to occupy, learning its twisting passages and hidden staircases, its rooms that had been closed for decades, and its galleries lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with suspicion and accusation. The servants spoke to her in whispers, if they spoke at all, dropping curtsies and fleeing before she could engage them in conversation, and she began to understand that this household operated under a pall of fear, whether of Alexander himself or simply of the name they served, she could not yet determine. Yet small things began to trouble the narrative she had constructed, tiny observations that refused to align with the monster of her childhood stories. The way Alexander's voice softened when he addressed old Thomas, a servant too aged and arthritic to perform any real duties, but who was kept on nonetheless with apparent affection. The fresh flowers that appeared in her chambers each morning, hothouse blooms that must have cost a fortune to maintain in this remote and windswept place. The way her fire was always built high against the northern chill, her meals always warm and generous, her every physical comfort anticipated before she could voice a need. She saw him rarely, glimpsed him sometimes crossing a distant courtyard, or heard his voice echoing from behind closed doors, but he seemed to orchestrate her care with invisible hands, ensuring she wanted for nothing, while denying her the one thing she had not known. She craved his presence, his conversation, some continuation of the connection they had discovered beneath their masks, before everything had shattered into scandal and necessity, and this strange half-life of a marriage. And lying alone in her vast and silent chamber, listening to the wind howl across the moors like the cry of something wounded and searching, Rosalind began to wonder if perhaps the cruelest thing about the Duke of Ravenscar was not his coldness, but his kindness. Kindness offered from a distance, kindness that asked nothing in return, kindness that suggested a heart far more complicated than 3 generations of hatred had allowed anyone to see. The weeks had passed in a strange and suspended rhythm, each day nearly identical to the one before breakfast, taken alone in her chambers, long hours of solitary wandering, dinner served in the vast dining hall, where she and Alexander sat at opposite ends of a table built for 30, exchanging only the most necessary pleasantries before retreating to their separate corners of the castle. And Rosalind had begun to feel less like a wife than like a ghost, condemned to haunt these halls alongside another ghost, both of them bound by chains of duty and circumstance that permitted proximity but forbade true connection. It was on such an evening, the autumn wind rattling the ancient windows and the fire in her chamber having burned too low for comfort, that she descended to the library in search of a book to occupy the empty hours before sleep, and she stopped at the threshold when she saw him there, standing motionless before the great fireplace with his back to her, his head bowed as though in prayer or perhaps in defeat, and she realized he was staring at a portrait that hung above the mantel, a woman with dark hair and eyes that held the same haunted quality she had glimpsed sometimes in Alexander's unguarded moments, a woman whose beauty seemed somehow tragic, as though the painter had captured not just her likeness but her sorrow. She should have retreated, should have left him to his private communion with whatever memories held him captive, but something in the broken line of his shoulders kept her feet rooted to the floor, and when the floorboard creaked beneath her weight, he turned sharply, and she saw that his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears hastily suppressed. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I did not mean to intrude." But he only shook his head and turned back to the portrait, and after a long moment he spoke in a voice she had never heard from him before, raw, stripped of all the careful armor he wore against the world. "My mother," he said simply, "Eleanor Blackwood, though she was born Eleanor Hartley, the daughter of a country vicar who had the misfortune to catch my father's eye at her first and only season," and the bitterness in his tone made Rosalind's heart clench as she moved closer, drawn despite herself into the orbit of his grief. She was 18 when she married him, 19 when she had me, and dead before her 30th year, not of illness, not of accident, but of the slow and merciless destruction that comes from being trapped in a house built on hatred, married to a man who saw her only as a vessel for heirs and a target for his rages when the wine took him. He fell silent, and Rosalind stood beside him now, close enough to see the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides, close enough to smell the brandy he must have been drinking alone in this room, full of books and shadows and memories too heavy to bear. "I swore I would never marry," he continued, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I swore I would let the Blackwood line die with me, rather than condemn another woman to this prison, rather than risk becoming what he was, rather than watch someone He stopped, swallowed hard, rather than watch history repeat itself in these halls that have known nothing but misery for generations. And Rosalind, who had spent her life being told that Blackwoods were monsters incapable of tender feeling, looked at this man who had married her to save her honor, while fully expecting to live out his days in cold isolation, and she understood at last that the walls he had built around himself were not cruelty, but protection. Protection for her, protection from himself, protection from the possibility of becoming the very thing he feared. "You are not your father," she said softly, and when he turned to look at her with something like desperate hope flickering beneath the grief, she held his gaze and repeated it with all the conviction she was only beginning to feel. "You are not your father, Alexander." The village of Ravenscar Hollow lay nestled in a fold of the moorland some 3 miles from the castle, and Rosalind had decided to walk there on a morning when the autumn sun broke through the perpetual grey with unexpected warmth, driven by a restlessness she could not name, and a curiosity about the people who lived under her husband's dominion. For if she was to spend her life in this remote corner of England, she reasoned, she ought to know something of its inhabitants, beyond the silent servants who tended her needs within the castle walls. She had expected to find the sullen poverty and fearful deference that typically marked estates ruled by cruel masters, had braced herself for whispered complaints and resentful glances directed at the Blackwood bride. But what she discovered, as she wandered the neat cobblestone streets, stopped her heart and rewrote everything she thought she knew. The village school stood proud and well-maintained, its windows gleaming, its yard filled with children whose laughter rang clear as bells across the morning air, and when she inquired of the elderly schoolmistress who had funded such a fine establishment, The woman's face softened with unmistakable affection as she replied, "Why, the Duke himself, your grace, though he made us swear never to speak of it, paid for every brick, every book, every slate, and visits twice a year to see the children's progress, though he thinks no one notices him watching from the road." The hospital came next, a converted manor house staffed by a physician trained in Edinburgh and 2 nurses whose salaries, Rosalind learned from a grateful patient recovering from a farming accident, were paid entirely from the Ravenscar estate accounts. She walked past cottages rebuilt after a fire that had swept through 5 years prior, each one constructed sturdier and warmer than before, the tenants speaking of their duke not with fear, but with a loyalty that bordered on devotion. "He came himself that night," one farmer told her, "worked alongside us in the bucket line till his hands bled, then housed every family in the castle until the homes were ready, and never spoke a word of it to anyone outside the village." By the time Rosalind returned to the castle, her mind was reeling with the weight of discovery, and she found Alexander in his study and confronted him with all she had learned, watching his face cycle through surprise, discomfort, and finally a bitter resignation that hurt her more than anger ever could have. "You hide this," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion she could not fully identify. "You let the world believe you are a monster when you have done more good for these people than most lords ever dream of. Why, Alexander, why do you not defend yourself against the lies?" He turned away, his profile sharp against the window's grey light, and when he spoke his voice was hollow with years of accumulated defeat. "Kindness from a Blackwood? Society would sooner believe the devil himself reformed than accept that a Blackwood might possess a shred of decency. I learned long ago that protest only invites ridicule, that attempting to change their minds only provides them fresh ammunition for their contempt." He paused, and she saw his shoulders rise and fall with a breath that seemed to cost him everything. "It is easier to be what they expect, to let them have their villain, and simply do what good I can in silence, where their hatred cannot poison it." And something broke in Rosalind's heart, then not for herself, not for the scandal that had bound them, but for this man who had accepted the role of monster, because fighting it had proved too exhausting, too futile, too painful to sustain, and she understood at last that the greatest cruelty the feud had inflicted was not the hatred between families, but the way it had convinced Alexander Blackwood that he was unworthy of being seen for who he truly was. As autumn settled fully over the moors, painting the heather in shades of amber and rust, something unnamed and unacknowledged began to bloom within the cold stone walls of Ravenscar, manifesting first in small changes that neither Rosalind nor Alexander openly remarked upon the distance between their chairs at dinner, shrinking imperceptibly each evening, the silences between them no longer stiff with discomfort, but softened into something companionable, almost warm, as though the frost that had defined their early days of marriage was melting drop by precious drop beneath the unexpected heat of genuine regard. They discovered a shared passion for literature one evening when Rosalind quoted Milton in passing, and Alexander completed the verse without thinking, his eyes meeting hers with surprise and something like delight, and from that moment their dinners stretched longer and longer as they debated the merits of Byron versus Shelley, as they argued playfully over whether Shakespeare's tragedies or comedies revealed greater truth about the human heart, their voices growing animated, their laughter his rusty from disuse, hers bright with rediscovered joy ringing through halls that had known precious little happiness in living memory. She told him of her lonely childhood in the gilded cage of Pemberton House, of governesses who taught her to be ornamental rather than intelligent, of stealing books from her father's library and reading them by candlelight beneath her covers, like a criminal hoarding contraband, and he listened with an intensity that made her feel truly seen, for perhaps the first time in her life. He spoke haltingly of his own youth, of tutors who feared his father too much to befriend him, of learning to ride alone on the moors because no neighbouring families would permit their sons to associate with a Blackwood, and Rosalind found herself aching for the boy he had been isolated, not by choice, but by inheritance, guilty of nothing except the name he bore. She began accompanying him on his morning rounds of the estate, ostensibly to learn her duties as Duchess, but truly because the hours apart from him had grown inexplicably hollow, and they rode side by side across the moorland, while he explained the drainage systems he had improved, the crop rotations he had implemented, the families who had served Ravenscar for generations, and she watched the way his face transformed when he spoke of the land he loved, the harshness softening into something approaching tenderness, and she thought that this was the real Alexander Blackwood, the man the world refused to see. Their hands brushed one afternoon as they both reached for the same ledger in his study, and neither pulled away for a long, charged moment that left Rosalind's skin tingling and her breath unsteady in her chest, and when she finally looked up she found him, watching her with an expression she recognized from the masquerade, that same hunger, that same bewildered want, but layered now with something deeper, something that terrified her precisely because it did not terrify her at all. They did not speak of it, this growing thing between them, this vine of connection wrapping ever tighter around two hearts that had been promised to loneliness. But it lived in the way he began saving passages from his reading to share with her, in the way she found herself dressing with greater care each morning, in the way their eyes sought each other across every room as though drawn by forces older than reason, and the castle that had once felt like a prison began to feel, against all expectation and all logic, like the first true home either of them had ever known. The carriage arrived without warning, on a morning when the first true frost had silvered the moorland, and Rosalind knew before she saw the crest emblazoned on its door that her fragile happiness had been found, had been tracked to this remote sanctuary like a fox run to ground by hounds who would never tire of the chase. The Earl of Pemberton descended with all the rigid fury she remembered from her childhood, that same cold displeasure that had governed her every breath for 22 years, that same imperious certainty that his will was law, and any deviation from it constituted a betrayal worthy of the harshest punishment. Alexander was away inspecting the northern boundaries of the estate, a small mercy that left Rosalind to face her father alone in the great hall, his travelling cloak still dusted with the evidence of his long journey, his eyes cataloguing every detail of her appearance as though searching for visible marks of Blackwood corruption. "You look well," he said, and the words carried an accusation rather than a compliment, as though her health itself proved some shameful accommodation to her circumstances. "Better than I had hoped, given your situation." He paced before the massive fireplace, and Rosalind noticed how diminished he seemed within these ancient walls, how the grandeur of Ravenscar reduced even an earl to something smaller than his title, and she felt a flicker of dark satisfaction that shamed her even as she savoured it. The news he brought was poison dressed as rescue. Viscount Thornwood, the man she had been meant to marry, the man whose cruelty she had fled into the arms of a masked stranger, had found new weapons for his wounded pride. He was spreading whispers through every drawing-room in London that Rosalind had been Alexander's mistress for months before the masquerade, that the entire scandal had been staged to force a marriage that would unite Blackwood wealth with Ashworth connections, that she was not a victim of momentary passion, but a calculating seductress who had betrayed her family willingly and repeatedly. "The lies are vicious," her father continued, "but lies can be fought with better lies. And I have found solicitors willing to manufacture evidence of Blackwood coercion letters that will prove he threatened your family, trapped you into this mockery of a marriage against your will." His voice dropped to something almost tender, almost paternal, and Rosalind recognized it as the tone he used when he wanted something. "Come home, daughter. Testify against your husband, and we will have the marriage annulled within the year. Your reputation can be salvaged, your future reclaimed. You need only tell the courts what everyone already believes, that you were an innocent girl destroyed by a Blackwood devil." The words hung in the air between them, and Rosalind felt the weight of two paths diverging before her, one leading back to everything she had known, to the gilded cage and the familiar cruelties, to a world that would welcome her return only if she betrayed the man who had shown her more genuine kindness than her own blood ever had, the other leading deeper into uncertainty, into a marriage born of scandal with a man society would always revile, into a love she had not yet dared to name aloud. She asked for time to consider, and her father agreed with the magnanimous patience of a man certain of his victory, and when Alexander returned that evening to find his wife pale and silent at dinner, she could not meet his questioning eyes, for how could she tell him that her family wanted her to destroy him, and that some treacherous part of her heart was not yet certain she would refuse? She sent her father away the following morning with words that were neither acceptance nor refusal, only a request for time that he granted with ill-concealed impatience, warning her that delay would only strengthen the Viscount's lies and weaken her position, But Rosalind barely heard him over the roaring of her own thoughts, the impossible calculus of loyalty and desire that had kept her sleepless through the long night. All that day she wandered the castle like a ghost, seeing nothing of the rooms she passed through, feeling only the weight of the choice before her, a choice that would define not merely her future, but the very person she would become. For to betray Alexander now would be to betray herself, to prove that she was indeed the shallow, manipulable creature her family had always believed her to be, and yet to refuse her father's offer meant closing the door forever on the world she had known, the family she had loved despite their failures to love her in return. Evening came with its familiar rituals, dinner served in the great hall where she and Alexander had grown accustomed to their lengthening conversations. But tonight she could not maintain the pretense of normalcy, could not smile and debate poetry while her soul hung suspended between two irreconcilable futures. And when he asked her quietly what had transpired with her father, the question gentle in a way that undid her completely, she found herself telling him everything, the Viscount's lies, the fabricated evidence, the annulment that awaited her, if only she would testify to his villainy. She watched his face as she spoke, watched the familiar mask descend over his features, the careful blankness that she now recognized as his armor against a world that had never stopped wounding him, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment before he spoke words that shattered something within her chest. Then, "You must go," he said, his voice steady and terribly kind. "If this is your path to freedom, to the restoration of everything I cost you, then I will play whatever role is required, the villain, the coercer, the monster society already believes me to be. I have worn that mask so long it fits me better than my own skin." He rose from the table and turned toward the fire, presenting her with the rigid line of his back, and she understood that he was offering her the gift of not having to see his face as he surrendered her, not having to witness whatever devastation lay beneath his careful composure. "Go back to your family, Rosalind. Let them restore your reputation. Find a husband who will not make you an outcast simply by bearing his name. I will sign whatever documents are necessary. I will confess to whatever sins they require. Your happiness is worth more than my—" But he never finished, because she had crossed the space between them and seized his arm, turning him to face her with a strength born of sudden, crystalline certainty. "I don't want freedom from you," she said, and her voice broke on the words even as her heart mended itself around them. "I want freedom with you, Alexander. I want mornings debating Milton and evenings riding the moors. I want to build something true from the wreckage of our family's hatred. I want you not because scandal demands it, not because honor requires it, but because somewhere between that first waltz and this moment, I began to love you." The word hung between them, terrifying and irreversible, and she watched his mask crumble at last, watched hope and fear and desperate, wanting to transform his features into something raw and beautiful. And when he kissed her, it was nothing like the masquerade, not stolen passion in shadowed gardens, but a deliberate choice made in full knowledge, a declaration of war against everyone who had ever told them that love between Ashworth and Blackwood was impossible. The kiss in the great hall was only the beginning, a spark that ignited something neither of them had the will nor the desire to extinguish, and when Alexander took her hand and led her wordlessly through the darkened corridors of Ravenscar, past the portraits of ancestors who would have condemned them both, up the ancient stairs to the master chamber he had occupied alone since his father's death, Rosalind followed without hesitation, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with the fierce certainty that she was finally, irrevocably choosing her own fate. The room was vast and shadowed, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace and the pale moonlight that filtered through heavy curtains. And when he turned to face her, there was a question in his eyes, a final offering of retreat that she answered by reaching up to unfasten the first button of her gown with trembling fingers that steadied as his breath caught audibly in the silence. "Rosalind," he whispered, and her name in his voice was a sacrament, a vow more binding than any they had spoken in that cold church months ago. And when he crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands, kissing her with a tenderness that made her ache, she understood that this was what the masquerade had promised, and scandal had stolen, not merely passion but communion, not merely desire but devotion. They undressed each other slowly, reverently, learning the geography of bodies that had been strangers until now, and when Rosalind's fingers found the raised scar that curved across his shoulder like a crescent moon, she felt him tense beneath her touch, felt the old shame rise in him like a tide. "My father," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "During one of his rages I was 15, and I had dared to suggest that perhaps the feud was not worth the cost of his soul." She pressed her lips to the damaged flesh, kissing the evidence of violence that had shaped him into the guarded, wounded man society believed was merely cold, and she felt something release in him, some ancient tension finally permitted to uncoil. Their coming together was nothing like the fevered urgency of the garden, nothing like the desperate collision of two strangers seeking escape. It was deliberate and devastating, a conversation conducted in sighs and whispered names, in the slide of skin against skin, and the gradual surrender of every defense they had ever built against the world that had hurt them both. Alexander moved above her like a man worshipping at an altar he had never believed he would be permitted to approach, and Rosalind arched into him with the abandon of a woman who had finally found the place where she belonged, and together they wrote a new story over the palimpsest of hatred and loss that had defined their families for 3 generations. Afterward, tangled together in sheets that smelled of wood smoke and something uniquely them, she traced idle patterns on his chest while he wound her hair through his fingers as though memorizing its texture, and the silence between them was no longer the careful avoidance of strangers, but the comfortable peace of 2 people who had finally stopped pretending. "I never believed this was possible," he confessed to the darkness, his voice rough with emotion he had spent a lifetime learning to hide. "Not for a Blackwood, not for me." Rosalind lifted her head to look at him, at this man who had been her enemy and her obligation, and was now, impossibly, her beloved, and she smiled with a certainty that felt like coming home after a long journey through storms. "Then we will make it possible," she promised, and when dawn broke over the moors, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they greeted it together, not as 2 people trapped by circumstance, but as husband and wife in truth at last, their union a rebellion against everything that had tried to keep them apart. The weeks that followed their union were painted in colors. Rosalind had never imagined Ravenscar capable of holding warm amber mornings spent tangled in bedsheets, while rain traced patterns on the windows, golden afternoons walking the moors with their fingers intertwined, evenings by the fire, where conversation gave way to comfortable silence, and silence gave way to touches that still set her blood alight with wonder. But happiness, she was learning, was a beacon that drew enemies as surely as moths to flame, and the world beyond their stone walls had not forgotten that a Blackwood had claimed an Ashworth, that ancient hatred had been betrayed by something as inconvenient as love. The first warning came in the form of letters, cold missives from her father, disowning her formally, from her brother warning that she had made herself a stranger to the family that raised her, from society acquaintances expressing shock that she had chosen to remain with the monster rather than accept salvation when it was offered. Alexander burned them without reading them aloud, but she saw the guilt that shadowed his features each time a new seal bore the Ashworth crest, the way he still believed, somewhere in the depths of his wounded heart, that she would have been better off without him. Then came whispers of another kind, reports from London that the Viscount's lies had evolved into something more dangerous, that he now claimed Alexander had compromised Rosalind deliberately as part of some elaborate Blackwood scheme to destroy the Ashworths from within, and worse, that certain distant cousins on the Blackwood side, men who had long coveted the dukedom and its lands, were expressing loud concern that the Duke's hasty marriage might produce an heir and forever end their hopes of inheritance. It was Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper who had served Ravenscar for 30 years and had grown to love her new mistress with a fierce maternal protectiveness, who first noticed that something was wrong. The tea that arrived at Rosalind's sitting room one afternoon had a strange, bitter undertone beneath the bergamot, and the old woman's face went white as she snatched the cup away and summoned the physician before Rosalind could protest. The diagnosis was arsenic, a small dose but unmistakably deliberate, and when Alexander learned what had happened, his transformation was terrifying to behold. The gentle man who read poetry by firelight and laughed at her terrible attempts at sketching vanished, replaced by something ancient and dangerous. A duke whose ancestors had been warriors and who carried their capacity for violence in his blood like a dormant inheritance, suddenly awakened. He raged through the household demanding answers, dismissing servants who could not account for their movements, threatening consequences that made even the stalwart footman pale, and Rosalind watched from her bed, where the physician had insisted she rest, as fear rippled through Ravenskar like wind through wheat. But it was not his fury that moved her, not the display of power that reminded the world why Blackwoods had been feared for generations. It was later, when the household had quieted and he came to her chamber, when he knelt beside her bed and took her hand and she saw that his own hands were shaking, that tears tracked silently down the face of a man who had been taught that tears were weakness, that vulnerability was death. "I cannot lose you," he whispered, and his voice broke on the words like waves against the cliffs below the castle. "I have lost everything I ever loved, my mother, my faith in my own name, my belief that I deserved anything good, and I will not, lose you too." She pulled him up onto the bed beside her, held him while he trembled with terror disguised as rage, and understood that their enemies had miscalculated badly. They had sought to destroy her, but instead they had shown her the full depth of what she and Alexander had built, the love that had grown from scandal's poisoned soil into something neither hatred nor arsenic could kill. The investigation began in the days that followed, Alexander pursuing the source of the poison with the methodical intensity of a man who had spent his life learning to trust no one. And it was in the dusty archives of Ravenscar's forgotten East Wing that they found the first thread of a truth far more devastating than attempted murder. A collection of letters, yellowed with age and tied with faded ribbon, hidden behind a false panel in a secretary desk that had belonged to Alexander's great-grandfather. Rosalind sat beside him in the dim light of oil lamps as they read together, piecing together a correspondence that spanned months and revealed a conspiracy so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that it stole the breath from her lungs and brought a terrible stillness to Alexander's features. The letters were written by a man named Cornelius Blackwood, a younger brother who had been passed over for the dukedom and had nursed his resentment like a poisoned flower, and they detailed his plan with chilling precision. He had forged documents that made it appear his elder brother had cheated the Earl of Ashworth in a land transaction, had ensured those documents found their way into Ashworth hands, had stood back and watched as accusation led to confrontation, and confrontation led to the duel that had claimed both the Duke and the Earl's eldest son on a misty morning 3 generations past. The jealous brother had inherited nothing in the end, dying childless and bitter in exile on the continent, but his legacy had flourished beyond his darkest dreams. 3 generations of hatred, of marriages destroyed and children raised on stories of Blackwood treachery and Ashworth vengeance, of 2 families bleeding each other dry, while the truth molded in a forgotten desk in an unused room. "It was all a lie," Alexander said finally, and his voice was hollow, emptied of everything except a grief so vast it seemed to have no edges. "My father hated your family with every breath he took, drank himself to death on that hatred, beat his wife and his son in the name of honor and revenge, and it was all built on a forgery created by a man whose only crime was being born second." Rosalind took his hand, feeling the tremor that ran through him like an earthquake, threatening to bring down walls he had spent a lifetime constructing, and she thought of her own father, of the cold fury that had shaped her childhood, the way the very name Blackwood had been spoken in her household like a curse, a contamination, a thing to be feared and despised. "We could tell them," she said slowly, knowing even as she spoke that it would not be enough. "Show them the letters, prove that the original wrong never happened, that everything since has been." But she stopped, because she could see in Alexander's eyes what she already knew in her heart, that hatred, once it takes root, becomes its own justification, that the wounds inflicted in the name of a lie had become real wounds nonetheless, that her father would sooner believe the letters themselves were a Blackwood forgery than accept that his entire identity had been built on another man's jealousy. "Truth does not heal," Alexander said quietly, gathering the letters with hands that had steadied into something like resignation. "It only explains. The healing, if it comes at all, must be something we build ourselves, stone by stone, year by year, despite everything that came before." And Rosalind understood then that their love was not an ending but a beginning, not a resolution but a first step on a road that might take generations to walk, and she pressed her forehead to his shoulder and let herself grieve for all the years lost to a dead man's spite. The collapse came without warning on a grey November morning, 3 weeks after they had uncovered the truth that changed nothing and everything. Rosalind had been walking in the gallery, studying the portraits of Blackwood ancestors with new eyes, wondering which of them had known the truth and carried it in silence to their graves. when the world tilted sideways and the floor rose up to meet her with a violence that stole consciousness before she could even cry out. She woke to Alexander's face above her, white as the marble statuary in the entrance hall, his hands gripping hers with a desperation that frightened her more than the weakness flooding her limbs, and behind him stood Dr. Merriweather with an expression she had seen once before, on the physician who had attended her grandmother in her final illness. The poison, they learned, had done more damage than anyone had realized. Her liver, her kidneys, organs that worked in mysterious darkness to keep the body alive had been quietly failing even as she had felt herself recovering, and now the strain of something else, something the doctor discovered during his examination, had pushed her system to its breaking point. "You are with child, Your Grace," the physician said, and the words that should have brought joy fell into the room like stones into still water, their ripples carrying not celebration but terror. "The pregnancy was precarious," he explained, with the careful gentleness of a man delivering a death sentence. Her body, weakened by the arsenic, might not survive the demands of nurturing new life, and the child itself had already been exposed to toxins that could have damaged it beyond any physician's ability to repair. He offered little hope, speaking of bed rest and prayers and miracles in a tone that suggested he believed in none of them, and when he left, Alexander stood frozen by the window, staring out at the moors he had once told her were the only things he loved, and she watched the last color drain from his face as he absorbed the magnitude of what they faced. "I swore I would never love," he said finally, his voice scraped raw, speaking to the glass rather than to her. "I watched my mother die of loving a man who could not love her back, watched my father drink himself to death on hatred and regret, and I swore that I would be the last Blackwood, that I would let the line end rather than pass this curse to another generation." And now he broke off, and when he turned to her, she saw something she had never seen in his eyes before: complete and utter terror, the fear of a man who has finally allowed himself to want something and now faces losing it before he can even hold it in his hands. That night, after Rosalind had been settled in the master chamber with strict orders not to rise, after the servants had been dismissed and the house had fallen into anxious silence, Alexander walked alone to the small chapel that sat in the castle's oldest wing, a place he had not entered since his mother's funeral, a place he had associated with empty promises and a God who had never answered his childhood prayers. The chapel was cold, dust motes floating in the moonlight that streamed through ancient stained glass, and he knelt before the altar where generations of Blackwoods had married and been christened and been mourned, and for the first time since he was a boy begging God to make his father stop drinking, stop hitting, stop destroying everything he touched. Alexander Blackwood, Duke of Ravenscar, closed his eyes and prayed. The winter storm descended upon Ravenscar on the third night of Rosalind's fever, as if the heavens themselves had conspired to seal them away from all hope of outside help. The wind howled across the moors like a chorus of the damned, driving snow so thick and relentless that by morning the roads had vanished, beneath drifts taller than a man, and the village might as well have been 1,000 miles distant for all the chance of reaching it. Dr. Merriweather had left the day before with promises to return, but now Alexander stood at the window watching the white fury consume the world and knew with terrible certainty that whatever happened in the coming hours, they would face it alone, he and Rosalind, and whatever servants remained, brave enough to venture into the sick room where the Duchess burned with a fire that seemed determined to consume her from within. He did not leave her side, not when Mrs. Hartley begged him to eat, not when exhaustion made his hands tremble and his vision blur, not when the old housekeeper whispered that the master would be no good to anyone if he collapsed as well. He simply pulled his chair closer to the bed where Rosalind lay tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, her face pale as the snow that battered the windows, her lips moving in constant murmured conversation with phantoms only she could see, and he began to read. He read to her from the volume of poetry she had left on her nightstand, verses about love and loss and the eternal turning of seasons, and when his voice grew hoarse, he simply talked, telling her stories of his childhood before his father's drinking had turned their home into a battlefield, memories of his mother teaching him to ride, of summer days when Ravenscar had seemed not a prison but a paradise, of the boy he had been before the world taught him that Blackwoods were meant to be hated and feared and nothing more. "I never told you about the time I tried to run away," he said, his hand wrapped around her burning fingers, his thumb tracing circles on skin that felt paper-thin and impossibly fragile. I was 9, and I had decided that if I could only reach London, I could find my mother's family. She had a sister she never spoke of, and I had this child's fantasy that if I found her, she would take me away from all of it, give me a new name, let me be someone other than the Blackwood heir. He laughed, a broken sound in the quiet room. I made it as far as the village before one of the tenant farmers recognized me and brought me home, and my father. He stopped, the old shame rising in his throat, then forced himself to continue because she deserved to know everything, deserved to understand the full measure of the man who loved her. My father beat me so badly I couldn't sit for a week, and my mother wept and begged and received a blackened eye for her trouble, and I learned that there was no escape from being a Blackwood, that I would carry this name and this legacy until it crushed me. Rosalind's eyes opened then, fever-bright but focused, and she looked at him with a clarity that seemed impossible given how she had been raving only moments before. "You escaped," she whispered, her voice cracked and barely audible above the storm's fury. "You escaped him, Alexander. You became something he never was, kind and good and worthy of love." He brought her hand to his lips, tears he had not known he was shedding falling onto her knuckles. "Stay with me," he begged, all pride abandoned, all armor stripped away. "Teach me to be the man you see, the man you somehow believe I am. Stay with me and I will spend every day of my life trying to deserve you." And in the darkest hour before dawn, when the storm still raged and the candles had burned to guttering stubs, and Alexander had resigned himself to a grief he knew would destroy him, Rosalind's fever broke at last, her skin cooling beneath his desperate touch, her breathing easing from its ragged struggle into something like peaceful sleep, her hand tightening around his with a strength that promised she was not ready to leave him yet. Spring came slowly to Ravenscar that year, as if the land itself had held its breath through the long winter of uncertainty, and now exhaled in cautious increments, first the snow retreating from the lower meadows, then the streams swelling with meltwater and rushing toward the sea, then the first brave crocuses pushing through the still cold earth of the castle gardens, purple and white and gold against the dark soil, like promises made visible. Rosalind watched the seasons turning from her window at first, then from a chair in the garden wrapped in blankets, Alexander insisted upon, despite her protests, that she was perfectly warm, and finally on slow walks along the gravel paths with her husband's arm steady beneath her hand, her body rebuilding itself with the same patient determination that had brought the flowers back from their winter sleep. The child grew within her as the weeks passed, her belly rounding beneath the loose gowns she now wore, and though Dr. Merriweather continued his regular visits with furrowed brow and cautious prognosis, even he could not deny that both mother and baby seemed to be defying the odds that had been stacked so heavily against them. The birth came on a warm May evening, when the sunset painted the moors in shades of rose and gold, and though the labor was long and difficult 18 hours during which Alexander wore a path in the carpet outside the birthing chamber, forbidden to enter, but refusing to go further than the hallway, when the midwife finally emerged with a squalling bundle in her arms, her weathered face was wreathed in the first genuine smile Alexander had ever seen her wear. "A son, Your Grace," she announced, and then, with a softness that surprised him, "And the Duchess is asking for you." He found Rosalind exhausted but radiant, her hair damp against the pillows, her arms cradling a small creature with a shock of dark hair and eyes that blinked open to reveal the precise shade of blue-green that had first captured Alexander's heart at a masquerade ball that now seemed to belong to another lifetime entirely. "He has your hair," Rosalind whispered, "and your stubborn chin. But I hope he might have my temperament." Alexander could not speak, could only sink onto the bed beside her and gather them both into his arms. This woman who had transformed his prison into a home, and this tiny, perfect being who represented everything he had sworn he would never have, never deserve, never risk his heart upon. The letter from the Dowager Countess of Pemberton arrived 3 weeks later, written in a hand that trembled with age or emotion, or perhaps both, asking in careful formal language if she might be permitted to call upon her daughter and meet the grandchild she had feared she would never see. Rosalind wept when she read it, and Alexander, who had every reason to refuse, whose father-in-law had spat at his feet, and whose mother-in-law had watched in silence while her daughter was called a traitor and a wanton, found himself writing a response granting permission because he had learned through loving Rosalind that healing required bridges built from unexpected directions. The Countess arrived alone, in an unmarked carriage, and when she stood in the nursery holding her grandson with tears streaming down her cheeks, Alexander withdrew to give them privacy and found himself ambushed in the hallway by a woman who had never spoken a kind word to any Blackwood in her 60 years of life. "I cannot forgive the past," she said quietly, "and I do not ask you to forgive what my husband and I have done to Rosalind, but I can see anyone with eyes can see that you love her, and perhaps that is where healing begins." 7 summers had painted the gardens of Ravenskar in ever brighter colors since the night when scandal had first bound 2 hearts together, and on this particular afternoon in August of 1854, the roses that climbed the ancient stone walls bloomed in such profusion that visitors often remarked. The castle seemed transformed, no longer the forbidding fortress of whispered rumors, but something gentler, something alive with the laughter of children and the quiet contentment of a household that had learned to measure its blessings, not in the opinions of society, but in the warmth of its own walls. Young William Alexander Blackwood, now 6 years old with his father's dark curls and his mother's sea-glass eyes, raced through the garden paths with the particular abandon of a child who has never known fear of the place he calls home, his delighted shrieks mingling with those of his younger sister Eleanor, who at 4 years old already displayed her mother's stubborn determination to keep pace with anyone who dared suggest she was too small for adventure. They were not alone in their play. Chasing behind them came 2 fair-haired children, cousins from the Ashworth side, whose parents had finally, hesitantly, accepted the standing invitation to visit Ravenskar, and the sight of Blackwood and Ashworth children tumbling together in the grass, where 3 generations of their ancestors had sworn eternal enmity, would have struck their great-grandfathers speechless with rage, yet to the children themselves it meant nothing more than the simple joy of having playmates on a summer afternoon. Rosalind watched from the terrace where she sat with her mother and her sister-in-law, her brother's wife, who had initially refused to even speak her name after the scandal, and who now discussed the London season with her as if they had never been anything but friends, and she marveled at how the years had softened what she once believed could never bend. The Earl of Pemberton had died the previous winter, never having spoken to his daughter again, and though Rosalind had wept for the reconciliation that would never come, she had also recognized that some bridges cannot be rebuilt in a single generation, that her father's hatred had been too much a part of his identity to ever be surrendered. But her brother had inherited the title and the responsibility of carrying the Ashworth name forward, and he had proven himself more pragmatic than proud. The forged document that had sparked the original feud now hung framed in his study as a reminder of how easily good people could be manipulated into destroying one another, and he had made it his mission to ensure his children knew the truth of their history, the whole truth, including the parts that reflected poorly on Ashworth's as well as Blackwood's. Alexander emerged from the house to join her on the terrace, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder in a gesture so natural and familiar that she leaned into his touch without thinking. This man, who had once been her enemy, her scandal, her reluctant husband, and who had become her dearest friend, her passionate lover, her partner in building something neither of their families had believed possible. "The children are demanding a picnic by the stream," he reported, and though his voice maintained its characteristic dryness, Rosalind could see the contentment in his eyes, the peace of a man who had finally stopped waiting for happiness to be snatched away. The feud was not forgotten, would never be entirely forgotten, for such wounds leave scars that future generations inherit, even when they do not understand them. But it was no longer a living thing, no longer a curse passed from parent to child, like a terrible inheritance that could not be refused. In its place, Rosalind and Alexander had planted something fragile and precious, the possibility that their children might know their cousins as family rather than enemies, that the Blackwood name might someday be spoken in London without the accompanying whispers, that love, patient and stubborn and brave, might prove stronger than hatred ever was. Dear listener, you have walked with me through the shadows and into the light, through scandal's bitter ash and love's slow resurrection, and now as our tale draws to its close, I would speak to you not as a storyteller but as a fellow traveler on this uncertain road we call life. For there are truths woven through Rosalind and Alexander's journey that belong not only to them, but to all of us who have ever feared that love might ask too much, that the past might prove too heavy, that the walls between hearts might stand too high to ever be breached. Consider how they began, two people who should have been enemies, whose very names were weapons their families had wielded against each other for generations, who met in masks and discovered that beneath the disguises we wear for society, beneath the roles our families cast us in, before we are old enough to choose, there beats something universal and aching and desperately alive, something that recognizes its counterpart across crowded ballrooms and says, "Yes, you, I have been waiting, without knowing I was waiting." They did not choose the scandal that bound them together, but they chose, and this is everything. This is the heart of what I would have you carry with you when you leave this story. They chose what to build from the ruins. They chose patience when the world demanded they hate. They chose to see each other truly when it would have been so much easier to see only the names they had inherited. And is this not the choice we all face, in ways large and small, every day of our lives, to see the person before us as they are, rather than as we have been told they must be, to extend grace where grievance would be justified, to believe that transformation is possible, that the story we were handed at birth is not the only story we are permitted to tell. Rosalind could have remained her father's daughter, bitter and bounded by old hatreds, and Alexander could have remained the fearsome duke, isolated behind walls of reputation and resignation, and no one would have blamed them. For the world forgives us readily when we become what it expects us to be. But they reached for something braver, something that required them to be wounded and to wound, to fail and to forgive, to hold on through nights so dark that dawn seemed like a story told to comfort children. The healing between Ashworth and Blackwood is not complete, perhaps it never will be entirely, for some scars are carried forward even when the wound has closed. But their children play together in gardens that once knew only enmity, and that is miracle enough. That is proof enough that we are not prisoners of our histories unless we choose to remain so. So I leave you with this gentle wish, dear listener, wherever you are, whatever walls stand between you and the love you fear to reach for, may you find the courage that Rosalind found on that moonlit terrace when she said yes to the impossible. May you find the patience that Alexander learned through seasons of small kindnesses and quiet hope. And may you remember always that the scandal of loving deeply, of choosing connection over safety, of building bridges where others would build walls, that scandal is worth every whisper, every wound, every moment of doubt. For on the other side of fear lies a garden where roses bloom even in the shadow of ancient stone, where children's laughter echoes across generations of silence, where two hearts that should have been enemies became instead the beginning of something new. Rest now, dear listener, and dream of dawn.